Representative Burnough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on Representative Alexander, there has not been found the widespread fraud that everyone keeps talking about. But what about the unintended consequence of the fact of identity fraud? When people start putting their numbers there, and we know that Georgia has had problems in the past of keeping things secure. So while we are asking for this, we also put at risk our Georgians for their information to be stolen because we also don't have, we're not as clear about what's going to be done with all that paper that's there with their ID numbers and other information.
That is absolutely a concern, and I thank you for raising that point. We are part of a coalition of many election groups and voting rights groups in Georgia, many of whom I'm sure you've heard from. And there are a number of groups, especially representing immigrant communities, in which identity theft is a huge concern because it's so pervasive amongst those immigrant communities. And we do worry that the additional ID requirements will impact these communities in terms of their willingness to provide such information.
Representative Chairwoman Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being here. I wrote it down because I heard you use the phrase a lot, and I think it's what the Speaker Pro Tem was asking you about, no evidence of widespread vote by mail fraud. And I kept wondering, what exactly does that mean? Do you have a definition, or do you have a particular quote or citation from which you lifted that language?
It is not a term that I think is defined in the Webster Dictionary or any other court necessarily. Though I use it here just to demonstrate that on the flip side, that if there are incidents of voter fraud, they've been found to be very just minute, small, not impactful. I'm happy to elaborate and follow that up with other studies as well. I'm just not as
okay. So a certain amount of fraud is acceptable then. Is that my understanding of what you're saying?
We want to ensure that we agree with you, the elections should be safe and secure. And there's just been no widespread voter fraud that would threaten that security.
Okay, and that's what I guess I want to focus on. What does that mean, no widespread voter fraud? Because if there is a certain amount of voter fraud, that means that someone who voted in the election who was not a legal voter, they basically disenfranchised me when they voted. Is that correct?
I think what's correct here is that if you're looking at the basis of this law, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud that would be a sufficient justification for the burdens that the photo ID requirement imposes on voters.
Okay, so what is it? What system do we have in current Georgia law that would allow us to identify your evidence of widespread vote by mail fraud?
I think that's a question that you have to pose to the Secretary of State and other elections managers. I know that they are always actively engaged in trying to seek out voter fraud. And so I would ask that you pose that to them. I'm not a voter fraud prosecutor, so I don't know.
That's what this committee is here to do, is to craft legislation that ensures the integrity of our voting system. And you're saying that our current system has shown that there has been no evidence of widespread vote by mail fraud. And I'm just wondering what in our current system would allow us to ever identify that.
Again, I would ask that you pose that to the Secretary of State and the election administrators of this state. I'm here to testify and say that there has been found no evidence of this fraud. Therefore, there's no legitimate justification for the burdens imposed by this law.
And would you agree that if our current signature match system is insufficient to identify the widespread evidence of fraud, that your statement basically has no meaning, that there very well could be evidence, very well could be widespread voter fraud, but our system is not set up to detect it.
I think that there are a lot of conditionals in your question there, and there are a lot of premises that I think we would disagree with. I am solely here just to testify on the impact of this legislation on voters who are voting by absentee, who may not have the identification requirements required in the law.
Thank you.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam, have you ever worked an election or been involved in the process of elections?
Are you asking, have I been involved as a poll worker or as an election worker? I have not. My experience has been as an attorney working on election protection efforts, as a student working on election protection efforts. I've registered numbers of people to vote. I have worked in numerous policy capacities doing research. So I am, I would like to say humbly well-read on election procedures, but I have not worked as a poll worker.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for being here. Are you aware that some elections are lost or won by one vote, even
I'm
here
sorry,
in the
can you
state of Georgia?
Can you say that again?
Are you aware that the sheriff of Wheeler County, Georgia, lost his election in 2012 by one vote?
I was not aware of that. Seems like a very close election. Exciting.
Yeah, and I saw personally in Milledgeville, a city council person win by one vote. So any fraud, any absentee ballot fraud is too much. Even if it's one, it's too much. We all want the same thing at the end of the day, that the elections are fair, honest, and that everyone votes their conscience and no one is manipulated, threatened. No votes are bought with a $5 bill or a cigarette and a can of beer. And there's evidence, and I have evidence to show some of those things. There's actually an election in Meriwether County School Board was actually thrown out because of widespread voter fraud. You know, in a perfect world, it wouldn't happen. None of us want it to happen. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. You want it to be fair, open, and honest. And that's what we're after too. I appreciate you coming and testifying and your knowledge, but I encourage you and others to get involved, to go work a poll, to be a poll worker, to be a volunteer, to see the process. I know we have 159 counties, and we have about 100 different ways elections are run in those counties. It's not all the same way. And that's what we're looking for, is that everything is done the same, whatever county it is. And I do thank you again, but we're open-minded and we're all wanting the same thing. And I thank you.
Chairman Smyre.
Thank you for your testimony. I really appreciate that. And I've read some of y'all's position papers, and they're very helpful. I want to tap on your experience. As I read the bill and try my best to, because I think voting is very fundamental. I mean, it's just one of those issues that I always speak very highly of, because I always encourage people to participate in democracy and the political process. But what really concerns me a little is the early voting section as it relates to the bill. And I know the early voting, and when you cut back on early voting, it disproportionately affects the harm voters of color who have the highest rate of weekend voting. And in Section 12 of the bill, when you eliminate some form of Saturday and Sunday voting, it appears to me that once I went and looked at it and kind of added it up, it looks like you can almost cut 108, 110 total available hours of early voting. And to me, that would have a disproportionate effect on a segment of our community. So what experience, what do you have that could add to that discussion on early voting? Because to me, early voting and absentee voting is another tool extended to the public so that they could, because we all have different circumstances in life. We all are different in terms of how we work and how we go about our total business. So we've been trying to provide every avenue we possibly could to enhance voting, because when you lift the water, all boats rise. Gives everybody the same and equal opportunity. And so, and what's your opinion and what's your thought on counties conducting early voters on Saturdays and Sunday? And if you eliminate Saturday and Sunday voting, how that would disproportionately harm voters of color and those who may have some other rationale and reason for not being able to go and may need that Saturday, Sunday voting. And how would that affect it if that were to, if there was 110 or 100 and so total available hours of early voting, how harmful would that be from disproportionately to people that maybe have to work, have other circumstances that require them to not be able to vote during the day? And so I just, could you address that for me, how this serves the voter?
Sure. I want to thank you again for that question, because it is another incidence, not only on its own of how this bill would disproportionately affect voters of color, low-income voters in particular, and other historically disenfranchised groups, but it's another provision that could exacerbate the photo ID requirement for absentee voting. A lot of these would, we're talking about a system of voting, so these burdens interact with one another and exacerbate one another. So I will, having, I didn't spend as much time on this portion of the bill as I did on the absentee photo ID requirement portion, but I believe that similarly, it would disproportionately impact those communities that I had mentioned before in my previous, my opening testimony. You reference voters who come from different circumstances, people who have to work on election day, for instance. And so early voting is some of the only opportunities some people are able to access the ballot. And so I think that we see that people, disproportionately voters of color, do need additional voting options and flexibility, including those days of early voting. I also agree, my reading of this bill is that it would extremely diminish the availability of early voting. And that is extremely problematic for us as well. Again, when we're looking at, from a legal perspective, the reduction of availability of voting options, we're looking at the populations that are disproportionately impacted and the portions of the populations who would need to otherwise early vote, and to understand their particular burdens, and those would be great.
Okay, thank you for your advocacy. I appreciate your
Thank you.
testimony. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Representative Burnough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I respect my colleague who said to you that you needed to go and possibly vote, work in election, I disagree that you don't have to vote, work in a voting poll or in some capacity to understand the importance of people having a right to vote. And the other thing I want to say is that the word widespread voter fraud was a term that was used early on before the election had ever started. So the proof was in that after our Secretary of State, Secretary of State of Georgia, who oversees the election, after all the 3 different counts that were required, they determined that it was that there was no widespread voter fraud. So that's where the proof came from. It came from our Secretary of State's office.
Thank you. Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you agree that there are checks and balances already with the application process?
Yes.
Thank you. Would you also, Mr. Chairman, another question, would you also agree that an enormous amount of the taxpayers' dollars was spent this previous election to look for fraud, only to be found that there were not widespread fraud?
I'm not intimately familiar with all of the budgeting processes, but I do understand that a lot of resources went into such efforts.
Thank you.
Counselor, we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much for your
much.
questions and the
Mhm.
opportunity to speak.
Kevin?